Today we are so fortunate to have with us two of the officials from the Obama administration who I think fairly can be said really helped to drive the administration's policy and accomplishments in the area of Title IX. Unfortunately, Russlynn Ali, who was another person who worked closely in this area and preceded Catherine at the Office for Civil Rights, was unable to be here due to another commitment. But we are very, very fortunate to have Anurima Bhargava, who was, I'm going to get this wrong, the head of the education section of the Department of Justice, and actually is a character to some extent in the book Missoula that was discussed last night. So that is pretty cool, bookending of the story of Missoula, Montana. And Catherine Lhamon, who is also an all-around wonderful person and a longtime friend of mine, and someone I admire very much, who was most recently the Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, the head of the Office for Civil Rights, and is now the chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And so if you will all join me in welcoming our two speakers. Sorry. Is this, yep, good, okay. I thought what might be interesting to do would be to just start off with a couple of questions about your work in this area and then transition into, of course, the topic of the conference, which is what now? And so I was wondering maybe if we could just start, if each of you could describe an achievement from your work in the administration that you think is one of the most important in the area of Title IX that you worked on, and why you think it really exemplifies the kind of work by the government that will be missed in this area. So we could just, whichever of you would like to start.
Sure. So let me just start by thanking Michelle for having us here. And I can't tell you what an honor it is to be on the stage with Catherine, who we've been in the trenches for more than a decade on lots of educational equity issues, and to be in the room with all of you who are so many people who have been my heroes and leaders in this work. So thank you for the opportunity to share some of what we did in the administration and hopefully talk about how we all collectively can move this work. So I just because I'm a character in the book, I've got to go to Missoula and talk about some of our work in Missoula. And I certainly think most of you in the room are probably familiar with Missoula in some form. The part about Missoula that I think is really important is an understanding of how it is that we in the administration try to approach work under Title IX, but work on sexual assault more broadly, which was to really think about all the different points of intervention to try and support students and to address sexual assault on Missoula's campus and within the Missoula community. And so the investigation of Missoula was not only under Title IX, as many of you know, and that looked at the university itself and the campus police department, but also under a couple of different federal statutes that speak to the prosecutor, the county prosecutor in Missoula, but also to the Missoula Police Department. And we did this across different sections of the Civil Rights Division, so the Educational Opportunity section and the Special Litigation section, but also with the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education. And I think part of the legacy of the work that was done during the Obama administration will be the fact that we did this administration-wide, and we did a lot of our work collectively. And part of the reason we did that was to speak in a stronger and singular voice about the importance of sexual assault and being able to address what was going on campuses around the country, but also to speak to the different ways in which we understood discrimination to be occurring. So there were multiple letters of findings. There were multiple resolution agreements coming out of Missoula, partly because some of those conversations and negotiations were more difficult than others, as is talked about in the book Missoula as well. But that's the idea of this being something where you have to talk to medical services providers, you have to talk to the Student Assault Resource Center, you have to figure out all the different players that could actually be part of a system. And that's really what we need to have on campuses around the country. It's not just a bunch of lawyers, it's not the administrative administrators, it's not a adjudication process, but it's really from the moment that someone is assaulted to the point at which they may make a number of different choices about how they want to go into the process that they are supported along the way. The other part of Missoula I think was really important was to think about this constant conversation we're having about what's the role of Title IX and the adjudication proceedings and what's the role of the criminal justice police process. And part of what we're trying to talk about is it's not a, send students one way or the other, because everyone who's in that process should understand that they have responsibilities to students. And so we see across the country this idea that it's a criminal justice issue, send them to the police, or the police saying it's a campus issue, deal with it on campus. And part of what we wanted to get to was you all have responsibilities in this process. And so I think also for us to bring that into Title IX in terms of understanding what it means to have someone actually have an educational opportunity taken away and what kind of environment they need to be in, that was the importance of Missoula in terms of our work.
So I'll echo Anurima's thanks to Michelle and also to Fatima and to Lisa Lynn and to all of you for being here. This is such an uplift to get to be in this room together and to be thinking about what's next and to know that there is a next. So thank you for that also. And then to be directly responsive to the question. I came to the Department of Education after Missoula had already been announced and after the resolution was already entered. And so I got to benefit from what you all had done and what could come next from it. I think I'm going to take the liberty of identifying two things because I have the mic.
They have
so you
two.
can tell me no. That I'm really excited about what we did. And one is the sunlight that we brought in the administration to the issue of sexual violence and to sexual harassment more broadly. The reality is that the law hadn't changed, that the core application of law within the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice hadn't changed in this administration. What changed was attention to it, using the full levers across the administration, the president, the vice president, the bully pulpit, each of the enforcement agencies having a White House task force that was focused on the topic, and really drawing attention to the way that we did the work and what it was that we were doing through posting the resolution agreements, through posting the list of schools that were under investigation, through posting information about how to file a complaint, what it is that we do when we do the work on filing the complaint so that there was more information about it, creating the notalone.gov website. And that really came from requests that were external to us. I will say that I went to the work in a very sort of pointy, lawyerly way that was, the law is the law, and this is how hard is it to figure it out, and this is what we're doing. And we got really a lot of criticism. We really got a lot of requests to make it much more public. And and I thought, well, okay, I guess we could say what it is that we're doing. And it wasn't really until, frankly, Jackie Spear created a website because she was mad at us because the Department of Education website was so difficult to navigate. And so she created her own website that collected our information, said this is what your website should look like. And I thought, oh, that is in fact what our website should look like. That would be better. And so then we became more transparent in response to that set of requests. And I think that level of transparency lifted up, in combination with the activism that was nationwide, lifted up what it was that we were doing, the value in coming to us, that we were serious about the work. I think schools started to realize that we would come after them if they didn't actually satisfy the law. I remember early in my time, Anurima and I sat on a panel like this together. I think it was at Dartmouth. And we got a question from the audience where one of the general counsels in the universities present said, look, this is new to us, and if we're trying really hard, could we not have you find us in violation, even if we violate the law? And I remember just thinking, like, I don't know what to do with that question.
I let Catherine take it.
You did. She let me take it. And the answer was no, because there's not an exception in Title IX that says if you're trying really hard, then it's okay to actually hurt kids. So, it was.
You know who we are.
Well, right. I mean, it was that piece was astonishing to me, and it was astonishing to me that the question began with "This is new to us," because Title IX is now 45 years old. It's not new, right? And the obligation to make sure that students are safe in school is not new. But what was new was that we were really clear that we meant it, and that we were really aggressive about saying we will make sure that students are safe on campus. And that piece, I think, was really important. So that was one. Then two, and I'll be shorter in my answer on two. But two was the way that we do the work itself within the Office for Civil Rights. I think before, frankly, my time there, the ways that we did most of the work, this area among others, was to be responsive to what the complaint said. And so if a complaint said, I don't think that the grievance procedures are fair at my school, the office tended to look at the grievance procedures, period. Or if a complaint said, I was raped and I didn't feel like I was treated well, the office would look at that set of facts and not more broadly. And I felt very strongly that we needed to look more broadly at the full context in which the work is being done. You need to look at the grievance procedures because it's important to know what the policy is, but you also need to know how the policy is applied. And so we really expanded the lens to look at files for a period of multiple years to see if there was a violation in one instance, if that was systemic, if there were patterns, if there were more things that needed to be changed. That slowed the work down, but it also meant that we were able to get to much more comprehensive remedies where necessary and to identify where there were training failures and other kinds of issues that needed to be addressed. And I feel very strongly that is the only way to do civil rights work, and it was really important to do that. So, Michelle, you asked what we will miss. I don't know yet what we will miss because it's too early in this administration, which is distressing in itself 4 months in, that it's too early to know what they're going to do. But it is too early to know really what they're going to do because they haven't done that much yet. So I hope we don't miss it. I hope that they keep that up.
Probably a good thing.
It may well be a good thing, but I'm gonna stay optimistic and here's things that we do know. They continue to post the list of schools that are under investigation, and that is shocking to me, given the level of pushback that I got. I literally had a Catholic president of a university tell me that I was gonna go to hell because I published a list of schools that were under investigation. And I thought, I mean, it's foiable, like it is public information. But it is at least good news that that's happening so far. I hope that the transparency continues. I hope that the comprehensive investigations continue. We'll see.
I'm still reeling from the thing you just said about the Catholic guy, so I have to file that one. So I guess that leads to another question, which is what were the things each of you experienced as the things that generated the greatest pushback? You mentioned the list. You also mentioned a comment that you made, which I thought seemed innocuous, but became quite notorious, which was, I think something to the effect of, the law hasn't changed, the law isn't that hard, just follow it, and we will enforce it. And that became very controversial. But maybe there are other instances that either of you experienced the greatest pushback, and whether that was surprising to you or not.
So I'll say this. I think Catherine probably took the brunt of a lot of the pushback around the country, in part because of the list, in part because of the numbers of investigations that the Office for Civil Rights was involved in. I think for the Justice Department, the very notion that it was the first time ever under federal law that we went and investigated and looked at a county prosecutor, the idea of introducing the notion of gender bias, or that there are significant ways in which if you're only investigating, 5%, 3% of the reports you're getting on sexual assault, that's actually a problem. Those were the kinds of places where we got pushback, which are going to be the case across the board in terms of actually saying to universities, but also to other actors in this process that they needed to comply with the law as it had stood, not just for the length of Title IX, but also the other federal statutes that have been in place for a little bit less time, but certainly with as much force. And so I think that's the idea, the very simple process of thinking that that it was part of institutions' responsibility to not have a process that re-victimized, that didn't have any kind of training of how it is that you're supposed to respond, that didn't account for, as many of you heard me say in the last 24 hours, the dignity and also the trauma that those who had been assaulted were going through. That I think was the thing that we got the most pushback on. I mean, certainly Missoula as an example of like, there were it took a long time to get out, and in part because it was the first time we did anything like that, and people were very much surprised by it and concerned about what it meant for communities and university communities around the country. I think some of the hardest work around this is that I think the work itself is just very hard, and so while I totally hear Catherine that this is the law and you need to figure out how to comply with it, it's also the kinds of issues and the kinds of circumstances that we were investigating are hard. They're hard for those who are investigating. They're hard for those we're trying to really serve as a voice for. I think part of the role of the federal government, we can talk about this later on, was to really support students around the country. And I think and then I'll say it was hard to really count for everybody in this room and others who had such an incredible wealth of knowledge and perspective and experiences, and to really find a way to integrate it into something that the more we put out there, the more there was to engage in conversations that didn't have easy answers. And so so that process itself of being on the task force and trying to handle what were lots of people yelling about lots of different things was something that I think people in the administration tried to do with as much humility and grace as we could, but was difficult because of how important and how much we cared about these issues. And I can say that for not only for the two of us, but certainly for our staffs, and for staffs who are, as many of you know, still very much in the Justice Department and in the Department of Education today. So I know how hard it is for us to be able to think about what's happening now, but it is as hard for them to think about how they continue this work.
I think that's true. I have the benefit or the burden of being now a multi-decade civil rights litigator, so I'm pretty Teflon about the kinds of criticisms that can come my way, because I've never done anything I haven't been criticized for pretty heavily. I mean, it's the nature of the work. The reality is that we got criticism for virtually everything that we did from virtually all sides, and I feel like that means there's a kernel to listen to in that, and there may be something that you can do more with. There were parts that were harder than other parts. It was very challenging for me in particular at the beginning to hear the level of distrust about what it was that we would do from survivor communities, and the level of anger and upset that felt like the federal government wouldn't be there for them, because I was really confident that we would, but we hadn't had time to show that yet. I also think that this last week is about the 3-year anniversary of releasing the FAQ document and the first task force report. Mm-hmm. And there were lots of people who were really thrilled. There were lots of people who were really upset about particular components in that. Some of those people are in this room. So, it really was, pretty intense for each of the things that we did. And I think that's important. There were times that were harder than others. I see Lynn Rosenthal, who's here. She was the White House advisor on sexual violence, and she was just an amazing advocate, an amazing leader for this work. And we did, in the first 90 days of the White House Task Force on Sexual Violence, we held 27 listening sessions with people from all perspectives on the topic, and they were very difficult for me. I think I sat through about 25 of them. Lynn, I think, sat through all 27 of them, and they were hard because of how vehement people felt about the work that we were doing and what it was we were doing. And they were hard because of the kind of vehemence about not moving forward, too, that we heard from some places. And for me, the worst moment was hearing a general counsel in the general counsel's session I see Lynn nodding, I think you remember it, say, look, these girls wear such tight jeans. And so what are the boys to do? And I felt like, oh my God, what century are we in? I cannot believe in this conversation, in this time, this is 3 years ago, that that's still where we are. And also, you know, I was representing the federal government, so I couldn't tell her what I truly thought. So that was also really hard for me. But now, yes, I think you all know. But it's that moment where it felt like, oh, you know, we've moved so far, we are moving this dial so much, this is so important, and still the person whose job it is to make sure the students are safe at that university, and I'm not telling you which university it was, but the person whose job it is to make sure students are safe at that university holds that view on this topic all these years later, and we haven't moved far enough. So it felt urgent, it felt critical, and there was constant criticism, but that is my life as a civil rights lawyer, so that felt normal.
Great. Is it possible to overstate the role of the federal government in enforcement? I think I asked this for obvious reasons. For example, in the case of OCR, 300 investigations sounds like a lot, but there are over 5,000 IAGs. And presumably people are getting sexually assaulted at all of those schools. And the investigations, as you said, move somewhat slowly. And the Justice Department did great things in Montana, but it didn't do that many of these kinds of investigations either, right? So I think that all of the advocates are feeling very upset about the loss of the federal government as an ally, or what we expect will be the loss of the federal government as an ally. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to overstate the role of the federal government vis-a-vis other actors and stakeholders in this situation.
So I wanted to say a couple things about where I think our role was, which is the investigations themselves, I think were one piece, incredibly important piece of the work, but I think the ways in which the federal government took a stand and a position and a role in this space, I want to define a little bit differently and a little bit more broadly. Just about the investigations themselves, I think for each of us, part of what, and this is, Catherine's in a situation where if she gets a complaint, she had to investigate it. We were in a situation where we got a complaint and we could make some decisions about where we wanted to investigate. But in both situations, particularly with compliance reviews, part of what we were trying to do was to figure out where there were gaps in the law, where there were places where we wanted to make sure that people understood what their responsibilities are. I'll use the Kansas State example from this past year of wanting to make sure that there was an understanding that fraternities that are, that are very much in part of the university and purported to be part of the university are places where Title IX extends. And so there was a lot of ways in which we were trying to do what I would call retail investigations that were going to have wholesale impact, and they were going to really sort of have people understand what their obligations were under the law, and also just in the case of, again, in the case of something like Missoula, to understand that the ways in which people had a role across the system. Those were incredibly important touchstones for how we actually think about the questions of sexual violence on campus. But there's another piece of what I think the government was trying to do here, and so the 27 listening sessions, the White House Task Force, the work that Lynn led and so many of us were a part of for many years, that was the idea of that work and the importance of that work was to see and to recognize those around the country who had not yet been recognized in that kind of national and federal way, but certainly hadn't even been recognized on their campus for the kind of pain and trauma that they had gone through, right? And so for us, the role of the federal government was to put sunlight on what was happening around campuses, but also to lift up again, back to the underscoring the dignity and the trauma that people were experiencing, and also to give universities tools and resources, and schools, K through 12 schools as well, tools and resources to be able to address what was going on. And so for so when I think about what the legacy of the work is, it's not the investigations. It's one that we changed a conversation collectively and together around the room, that we listened to one another, and that we laid a platform and a foundation for this work to continue through all the work that people around this room are doing now, but also that we gave those tools and resources that, whether or not there's, whatever happens to the guidance or whatever happens in terms of investigations going forward, I think those tools and resources are still out there for everyone to be able to use, to be able to address what's going on campuses. And that's the impact. And the investigations, again, because of the collective way in which we did this work, because we recognized that we had lots of different tools at our disposal and that we should use them, and more importantly, because you had people within the administration who were collectively committed to addressing these issues, and to, we had conversations so regularly, Catherine, more than I did even, with people across the administration and how we actually address some of this. And that's where I think the legacy really lies.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all that Anurima said, not surprisingly. But in addition, I don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of the federal government, and I don't think it's possible to overstate the importance of the tool that each of us holds now for our own activism through campus advocacy, through public advocacy, through litigation, through whatever the other tools are external to the government as well. The government lever, investigations, Sunlight, lifting up the topic, talking about it, was incredibly important in actually finally pushing a movement forward 40 years later, right? And so that was really good, and I'm glad it happened, and I hope that some vestige of it holds. The government action always has followed what private action has been on this topic. The reality is that the first regulations about Title IX that my office issued in 1975 set the standard for the way that you would do the investigations about sex discrimination, but it wasn't until 1977, 1978, when Kitty McKinnon and others were litigating that sex discrimination actually counted as sexual harassment, that then turned to, okay, we'll use those tools for that purpose. And so that was the government following activism externally. We still have that tool, all of us, now, and what I hope we did was to actually move the country in a way that we don't go back. We now understand that sexual harassment, sexual violence is a form of sex discrimination, that all of our kids in all of our schools, P12 forward, all of our kids in all of our schools have a right to expect not to be harassed, raped, assaulted at school, and that we are a full community that will be there for them, and the litigation lever persists. The availability of federal enforcement persists. The law didn't change. So there's nothing different about the obligation for the Department of Justice, the obligation for the Department of Education still to enforce. So they ought to still be doing what we ask of them. We ought to still be asking that of them. And in addition, our schools, I think, no longer have the luxury to believe this isn't our issue, there's something else that's more important for us to look at, this isn't something that we need to be focused on. I think we own that. So in that sense, the government lever was faster than some others. It was really important in pushing the conversation, and it's not our only lever, and so we're not bereft now wherever that stands.
We're not bereft.
That's my uplift.
Not bereft. Okay, well, I guess we'll take that. And following from that, what do you think actually the best areas for opportunity, which levers, given that we have now, perhaps we're not bereft, but we're pretty close, okay? We're in the we're bereft adjacent, okay? And so given that, and given that we presumably, or at least hypothetically, shall we say, we have lost the support of the federal government on this issue, certainly in the very aggressive ways that you described, Anurima, that we did have it. What are our best avenues for continuing to move the agenda forward if possible, or at least not to lose all of the significant ground that has been gained?
So I just want to jump in a bit. It was mind-blowing for me to be sitting in the White House watching the President of the United States say, we have your back and we believe you and we will be there for you, for all survivors. And in particular when he said that we have to protect our transgender students, we have to protect all of our students, our undocumented students, everybody has the same right and we will be there. That was amazing, and I don't think we will hear that speech again from this president. I'm not,
You don't think so?
I'm acknowledging that. And I think this administration is at best vulnerable on this topic, and so has something to prove. The selection for whom to prove that with in the acting role in my old job is not inspiring for me, but nonetheless, that person has some record on this topic, and I think that's deliberate. So I say that to say there's something to hold. I can be Pollyanna in this moment. There's something for us to hold on that the administration at least thinks it has something to prove. And so that means I don't think that we will hear the same tenor in rhetoric. I don't think we will see the same volume of commitment, but I do think we will see ongoing investigations. We have already seen from this administration 3 resolution agreements that have come out, 2 higher ed, 1 K-12 from the Office for Civil Rights. It is true that I put those in negotiations before I left, but they did come out. And
Right, which is not nothing, because they
It is
could
not
have
nothing.
never come out.
Right, they could have not come out at all. They could have not done any media about them. They could have been less comprehensive. They were still comprehensive. They were still the right kinds of resolutions. They were really, really good for those students, and they still advertised it. So there's a there still for us to hold on to, and I don't think we should be reliant on the federal government to be the savior. I don't think we should have been reliant on the federal government to be the savior. The reality is that Office for Civil Rights, the Department of Justice will always be understaffed. They will always not have as many resources as there is need around the country. And so it is always important to be doing self-advocacy, external advocacy in the places where that's viable also. There's a niche that is the federal government's and that is not somebody else's. That it is the federal government that can enforce its regulations. That's not somebody else's to do. And so that's a loss if they don't do that well. But there's real availability, and there's been real movement in the law in ways that's been really productive. There's an 11th Circuit decision in which there's a line in that decision that says for K-12, it is predictable that sexual harassment and sexual violence will take place in schools, and schools have to be there to watch it. That's unbelievable. It's unbelievable from the 11th Circuit. It's unbelievable that we have that in a decision, and it's true, it's right. And so then that's actually guidance for our schools around the country, and that happened in private litigation. That didn't happen from the government. So there's movement available for us, and I think we need to. What's so exciting to me about this set of 2 days, this conversation, these people together, is the way forward is something that we are charting and we're insisting on, and we will still be there. So schools don't have the luxury to think, okay, that was then and this is now. We don't have to do that anymore. They have to know this is now and it's now. And also all of our communities, our student communities, have a better understanding of what their rights are and what they're entitled to and what they can expect. Our parent communities have a better understanding of what they can ask for their schools, what they will want. That we are just in a totally different place than we were 4 years ago. And we should continue advancing that, and that we can do. And that I have a lot of optimism about.
So I'll try to pick up on the optimism, and then maybe I'll end on. Maybe I'll start. Well, actually, I'll start with
Start
the
on the
depressing.
down note.
I'll start with the depressing note.
So you can build.
I certainly agree with Catherine on the possibilities of what it is that the federal, leaving open the potential and the possibilities of what it is that the federal government may do on these issues. And part of my faith in that is because there are people within the government still who I think are extraordinary lawyers and extraordinary advocates and extraordinarily committed to these issues. That said, I think that some of you heard me say this yesterday too, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that the leaders of the federal government right now are people who multiple people engaged in some form of sexual assault or domestic violence. I think that is something that we have to not only acknowledge, but understand what its implications are in terms of the messages it sends to young women and young men around the country about what is permissible and what is about value and about dignity and about how it is that we're going to take account of that kind of behavior and whether or not you are qualified or appropriate to lead this country, right? So that's something that across the board, we have to figure out how to handle. And that is outside of the context of what it is, what kind of actions or work could be done within the federal government. And so I think the reverberations of that kind of violence and an election that in and of itself was an act of sexual violence or racial violence in so many different ways for communities around the country, we have to understand what the reverberations of that are for people not only who are doing this work, but and who may be impacted and who we may be advocating for, but for just the ways in which it's being internalized by young people around this country. And that is where I'm most concerned and most worried about where we are. And that's certainly a sea change from what you get when you have the Attorney General, the Secretary of Education, and the President of the United States acknowledge and value the communities that we were advocating for. So that's a depressive note.
Yes.
The more
It's
positive.
real. It's real.
Yeah.
I mean, it's real.
And I don't think it's a no. I just think this is the context that we're in.
Right.
And if we can't really understand and address the culture change that I think all of the work that we're doing was trying to help promote in communities, then that's the crux of what we're going to be continuing to deal with for many of our lifetimes. I'll say one note on this, which is Congressman John Lewis, who I had a chance to hear say this a couple weeks ago, was basically, he talked about how he was a pilot. He learned how to be a pilot light and not a firecracker, and how we have to sort of really think about being in it for the long haul. And so I think we all have to think about that, and part of this time that we were in together in the last couple of years was really being a pilot light, and at times being firecrackers too, but really understanding what it means to continue to be these pilot lights that are in it for the long haul. On the more positive note, I do think that there has been progress in the courts. I'm not one to believe that we should go from a situation in which we started to think about our roles in the federal government as sort of the protector in some ways, and now go to the federal courts and think they're going to be the protector. We'll see what happens. I think that they are certainly a place to get some movement on these issues. But the things that give me optimism are that universities around the country will say that this is one of the number one, if not the number one issue that they are trying to grapple with. That is fundamentally different than it was 5-10 years ago. What gives me hope and optimism is that young people around this country, many of whom in this room, have led movements and have led processes on their campuses from high schoolers in Norman, Oklahoma, who are out in hundreds to try and make sure that they're protecting their fellow students, to all of the kind of movements we see on campuses around gender violence, around sexual violence, and around racial violence. That's where, to me, the optimism and where the pressure can be, and where the optimism lies for how we continue to push forward on these issues, and then also the recognition. And so we talked I found it fascinating yesterday. Some of us were talking about media saturation. I don't think we've saturated the media. I think there's a lot of work to go. But the idea that the media has paid the kind of attention it has to these kinds of issues, and I hope will continue to, and we were talking at breakfast today about the Associated Press and mapping out incidents of sexual violence in high schools around the country. That kind of drumbeat and that kind of focus is what we need to be able to continue to have this be part of the consciousness. The work that we all try to catalyze is work that goes on in communities around the country. It has to be the work that goes on in communities around the country, both in schools and also in every one of our neighborhoods. And so that's where the work lies, and that's where the optimism has to lie too. And so I don't mean to, I think we in the federal government tried to do what we could to jumpstart this work and to highlight it and to spark it. But again, the implementation, the everyday conversations, the ways in which we're going to stand and protect each other and respect each other are going to be what happens in communities. And that's where I think there's more room and more conversation than we've ever had.
So that was very optimistic. Do you have any specific strategies or initiatives as you if you think about all the different places that you've been, people that you've encountered, things that you've heard about on the various listening tours, but also through investigations or just all the different contexts that you've made, I think you're probably both in one of the best positions to have the 30,000-foot view. So when you think about that, can you pull out a couple of things that you think are successful results or strategies that people have used that you think might be beneficial in pushing the government to act? What were the things, let me rephrase that, what were the things that made you sit up and take notice and take action? What are the things that people can do to be that pilot light or to be that firecracker or to make what John Lewis calls some good trouble out there?
Necessary trouble.
And necessary trouble to make you pay attention when you were in that role.
So I said that I'm pretty Teflon, so I was going to pay attention anyway. But
I just want to say that I predicted you would say that.
So, you did, yeah.
I did.
You've known me long enough. But, but I will say, the day that I went for my Senate confirmation meetings was the day that Know Your Nine had its Ed Act Now rally outside the Department of Education. And I felt like, right, people rally. I was an activist, and that, that's why I got appointed. So they're rallying. That's good. Maybe I can join them. People didn't think that was a good idea for me to do since I was about to be confirmed. They were hoping, so I didn't. But the other folks in the department were anxious and worried, and what does that make us look like? And I thought it makes us look like people have something they want from us. That's fine, and that's what people do. I was fairly unique in my not being nonplussed response. Most of the other folks in the building cared a lot about having somebody rallying outside the building, cared a lot about Tyler Kincaid's articles, cared a lot about the kinds of criticism that was lobbed at us. And so I think you should know that. I'm unusual. Other people do care. So it's a good idea to continue with that activism.
She cares too.
I do. I care a lot in the sense that I want to hear if there's something we should do about it. It doesn't make me mad. It didn't make me feel like suddenly I need to turn attention to that as distinct from something else. I'm assuming somebody's going to have something to criticize about everything we do, and so we should just hear it. And it's not upsetting to me. But the reality is, if you wonder if it matters to go march, it does. If you wonder if it matters to send a letter saying we don't like X, Y, and Z, things that are happening, it does. If you wonder if it matters to hold a meeting, to ask to have the secretary come and meet with you, to ask to have the attorney general meet with you, to ask to have whomever meet with you because you are concerned about something that is happening, it does. And if you don't do those things, if we let that fall off, we will see less forward movement. More bad things will happen. So it's just not nothing to be engaged in activism. It is not nothing to have articles written. It is not nothing to sue. All of the things that we have at our disposal that are still tools that we have are incredibly meaningful. Somebody cares. Some people care more than I do. Some people care for different reasons, but somebody does care, and they are incredibly productive. If we instead say, look, we lost a federal partner, they're not going to be as aggressive, they're not going to care as much as the last administration did, and so we'll turn away, more harm will come. That's just not a good next approach. It is really, really important to continue with all of the forms of activism because they will make some gains, they will stop some harms, and they will definitely communicate a message and continue to build community.
So I agree with Catherine, and I think there's just two things I'd add to that. One is the recipients of all of your activism should be a broader set of people. Right? And so it may have been that the recipients of your activism were folks in the federal government, the White House, or whoever else that you were trying to contact on to raise some of these concerns. I think that's got to extend to state and local, and I think it has to be that we figure out how to tap into this incredible energy that continues around the country, even after 100 days, of how to get people involved in holding their own institutions accountable. And so for all of us in the room, understanding what that means and what that looks like is part of our charge now, is to give people, again, the tools and resources to be able to hold their own institutions accountable, whether that be their schools, or the universities and colleges that they're attending. And so that's an incredibly important piece of this. And I think the question of and I'm going to do a shout out to Eliza Bayard and GLSEN and how they looked at some of the transgender issues in the last couple of months, which is to take transgender students and their families without advocates into a room with the Secretary of Education and say, this is why this matters. We are why this matters. And you have to look us in the eye and understand what it is that we're trying to fight for. There is nothing more compelling and difficult to address than that, right? And so I think part of it's for all of us to get out of the way and to have some of these stories and some of those in the room who can share the difficulties that they had in terms of a process on campus, the difficulties they've had in terms of trying to actually go on every day after they've been sexually assaulted. Those are the kinds of stories that need to come up to the federal government, to have thousands of letters presented to the secretary, to have thousands of letters presented to the Attorney General. I know that the education section of Civil Rights Division got literally thousands of emails of stories of transgender students around the country in the last couple of months. And yes, there's a guidance that got rescinded with whether or not I buy it or not, some opposition from Secretary DeVos. But the idea here is that those voices are being heard, and that's part of the conversation and the kinds of input that they're taking into account. So I entirely agree that that's got to be part of what happens. They're asking for that. They're asking for some. I mean, I know the people on the inside are asking for some of that kind of input to be able to continue to do the work that they're doing in whatever way they're going to be able to do it. But I also think that we've got to figure out how we arm ourselves as in our cases now, still civil rights lawyers, but private citizens who wherever we may land, and in my case that's somewhere different every day it seems like, but wherever we may land, to really try and advocate for the communities that we're a part of and for the institutions there.
So we're going to go to Q&A and take questions from the audience. I'm sure they have a lot of great questions for you. And so if you will raise your hand if you have a question for either or both of our distinguished panelists, Lisa will come to you with the microphone. As soon as she turns it on.
Check, check.
I think it was already on.
As you saw yesterday.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sally Kinney from Tulane University, and thank you. You came and talked to our president and made a real difference. And we're, I think, one of the top 1% of the schools that's done everything that's on the menu. We've made a lot of progress in the last couple of years thanks to the pressure from the federal government. So we managed to not do the AAU survey. We did the ARC3 survey. We publicized all the grievance actions in an annual Shifting the Paradigm meeting where all the students can attend. We instituted a bystander program. We hired a dedicated Title IX officer. And we just did our survey, which we had more than a 50% response rate for. And the incidence level is still really, really, really troubling. And I feel like we haven't moved the needle at all on prevention. We've done some work towards justice, and we've done some work towards survivors and made almost no progress towards prevention. So I'm here very interested to develop what's next on the menu. But my question is sort of following up your remark from the General Counsel about the tight jeans. The equivalent in New Orleans is, with our party culture, alcohol culture, this is just part of party and alcohol culture. And I think people in the senior administration, as well as many feminists, really believe it. It could be just taken out of Laura Kipnis's book about that the women need to be more responsible about alcohol, and until that happens, there's nothing the institution can do towards prevention. So I'd be interested if you have any thoughts that can help us about that. And also, now I feel like the administration is saying, oh, we've done all these new things, let's just let them settle and see whether they have any effect, which I think if you look at the incidence rate, is so deeply problematic, then we're not in a state of almost shutdown or emergency, and we're now moving towards well, the pressure's off now, can't we just wait and see how the things we've already done have an impact?
So I'm so glad that you raised that. Among the most searing conversations I remember from the various schools I visited and the conversations we've had was hearing your president say, the bars are open, they're across the street, and the kids are going to just keep being served, and so there's really nothing we can do. And that contrast from your president, from everything else we saw on your campus that was amazing about the posters up, the safe spaces. Is my mic not on? Shall I yell, or can you? Now you can. Okay. You had an amazing preventive practices already implemented ahead of the curve for other schools, and it was jaw-dropping to me to see how far ahead you were, and I say you advisedly, you led that on your campus, and I'm really grateful specifically, and also for the kinds of things that were moving on your campus. And it was devastating. It was such a kick in the gut to hear the top of the administration say that this is just going to continue because people will still be drinking, and that's just part of party culture. That is poor leadership. That is undermining the rest of the work that you're seeing on your campus, because it creates a permission structure, it excuses a set of behaviors, and it directs people away from the prevention spaces that you had created. And that's a hole still in our work. It is not enough to say people should be a bystander. It is not enough to say that we have effective responses when something happens. It's not enough to say that we will have a safe space and we will support you when you're hurt. We also have to be in a space where we actually change who we are and how we relate to other people and what we think is acceptable. And that piece requires work. I think it requires the kind of work that you're doing, but it also requires leadership change and that's and direction at the very top of a university at every level down, and a college, and an elementary school, and a middle school. I just really want to be clear that should be a set of expectations that we voice across all of our communities about what we want for kids. And I don't mean to isolate Tulane on that. I certainly don't think Tulane is alone in it, and I also don't think colleges and universities are alone in that. I mean, the kinds of other really devastating investigations, information that we learned include here in California, in an investigation in West Contra Costa, there had been a pretty notorious gang rape on campus, and we then opened an investigation. This preceded my time. We opened an investigation to identify what was happening K-12 in that district, and we learned of other rapes in the district. We learned that administrators in schools knew that kids were being groped, that they were being harassed, that they were being catcalled, and the administrators didn't act because they said, well, this is just how kids are. And worse than that, this is a heavily Latino district, the administrators said, well, that's their urban culture, which is not even coded, right? About who we don't expect to succeed, who we don't expect to actually be protected, and what it took to change that for kids in West Contra Costa. What it will take around the country to change that is bringing in the community to say that's not what we expect for our kids, and that's actually not acceptable, and that's not who we will be. And I have seen you leading that. I hear your frustration about not seeing it take hold as much as you would want. I do think you have made more gains than you give yourself credit for on that campus, because I saw it. And it's not enough to make some gains, because every time somebody's hurt, then that's harm. And so we need to still want more and be pushing for more, while also being grateful for what you have already moved.
Sally, I'm going to just say one quick thing on this. I was just in New Orleans a couple days ago, and I remember saying to a friend's nephew who was going to Tulane, like, stay away from the booth, right? So like that, I still remember that exact conversation that Catherine's talking about. I just want to say one thing about how we look at these questions, and I think it's part of the ways in which we've looked at lots of things that happen within the university process, which is when there is a moment of violence, we talk about how to address that particular moment of violence. And what we really need to be talking about is all the structures and all the ways in which we've allowed that moment of violence to happen. And then to think about all the ways in which we have to make sure, and this is what the responsibility is under civil rights laws, to make sure that moment doesn't happen again. And that means that it's not a wait and see moment. It is we have to actively make sure. That's the responsibility, to make sure that something does not happen again. And so I think part of the way in which we have to think about the obligations of each of us, right, in terms of what's happening on college campuses and what's happening in schools, is to understand the context and the history and the structures that lead up to that moment of violence. And then what do we have to do about it afterwards? And that is not a 2-week afterwards process. It's not a 2-day afterwards process. One of the things that I think we were all concerned about is what the impact of some of the work on the federal level was in terms of universities and colleges and schools hiring a bunch of lawyers to try and think about these issues and liability around them from all different sides, but not really thinking about what they needed to do in terms of prevention, support, interim measures, all the things that we knew were really important to try and actually make sure that students had educational opportunities, and they continue to do that. And so part of this also is to make sure that we don't take a litigation frame or a legal frame to this, which is something that, the idea of how we actually address culture change, rape culture, permissibility, the ways in which young people are actually trying to figure out how they can interact with each other, that's not a legal moment. And if we actually treat it as a legal moment, we're going to be in serious trouble for actually having lasting change happen on campuses. And so, and the analogy I'll use is what we think of in terms of admissions. The idea that the admissions to universities is the moment where we can think about things like inclusion, diversity, who we're bringing in to a community, and we do nothing on the beginning part of it or the end part of it to try and actually make sure that community thrives. That's the same kind of thing we would be doing here if we just looked at the moment of violence and not anything that happened before or after it.
Great.
I'm going to hand the microphone to you, but two moments of personal privilege. One is that in order to get as many questions out as we can, please be brief with your questions. The other is, I don't know if it's New Orleans and a sort of Southern sensibility. When somebody says, bless her heart, that's not what they mean. It's important to call a thing what it is, right? Anurima spoke the words rape culture, party culture, where there are people suggesting that you show your tits so that they can throw plastic baubles at you. That is about objectification of women and degrading women. That is not about partying. That is about rape culture, and that is about devaluing people, and there needs to be clarity when people try to whitewash that or laugh it off or dismiss it, that is where the problem starts.
Let's take 2 or 3 questions and then in a row before we have more answers, so that people who have something that they want to ask get the opportunity to ask it. So go ahead, and then maybe we'll get some other hands up too.
Thanks. I'm Linda Correa. I'm in private practice in D.C. And my question picks up right where you just left off. I've been thinking about all of the institutions that were on the list and are on the list, and all of the resources that they've put toward addressing policies and procedures and prevention and counseling and everything that goes along with it, and all of the lawyers that you just mentioned that they've hired to do all of those things, who also have an interest in making sure that they get it right somehow. Do we have actors in those institutions that we can turn to leaders? They've been on the list, they were caught in this moment of, you guys have been getting it wrong, and they were investigated, and news articles and everything, negative attention that they didn't want. Can we turn them to leaders and allies to say, this is the way universities, any school, ought to be doing this? This is the way we monitor and control our communities and protect students. I don't know who those people are. I've interacted with some because I'm on the other side of cases, and they're not necessarily going to tell me, yes, I'll join with you in this effort, but there've got to be actors on the other side who would like to be leaders in that way, in a positive way, and maybe you can help us identify
Okay,
those.
so that's good. Do we have a couple, let's get a couple other questions out. There's one in the back and one over, let's try to see if we have any students maybe who want to ask questions.
Jeanne Lee, California Attorney General's Office, not speaking on behalf of the Attorney General. Not to say he wouldn't support me, I just didn't have time to run it up the flagpole before I came. So my question kind of takes off on what she just said. You know, I've been doing training around the state with the community colleges, trying to train adjudicators who would be deciding the cases, determining responsibility and appeals, but I'm not getting the administrators who are making those decisions at the dean or vice president or the president level. I'm getting the people who are already committed to this area. And I'm talking about debunking myths and, you know, rape culture and all that, but I'm preaching to the choir. So my question is similar. How do I get to the level of people that I want to address? Because I don't know how to draw them in to the trainings that I'm doing.
Great, let's do one more.
Hi, I'm Catherine Pojan. I'm a graduate student at Northwestern University. I take the point that I think both of you guys made about the danger of if we were to stop treating the federal government as a partner. I think that's a really valuable point, but at the same time, I know a lot of students are concerned about if they were to continue filing complaints with the OCR, for example, and what's going to happen as a result of that, and the danger of possibly setting like a bad enforcement precedent and worrying about the kind of message that the Trump administration might be sending to other schools subsequent to that. And I'm not really sure where to strike a balance between those two worries.
Great, all those good questions. So whoever would like to go first, and
I'm going to jump in.
Get started.
A couple of things. One, the list itself, being on the list does not mean you violated the law. And being on the list doesn't make a school more or less likely to be a harmful institution than another, and that just feels really important to me. It means that we OCR received a complaint about the school. Some of those schools have not done something wrong. There are lots of schools that are not on the list that could well be on the list. So the list is an indicator of investigation. It's not an indicator of harm. The resolution agreements where OCR identifies harm is an indicator of having harmed and the need to create change. And so I just think that's a very, very important distinction to remember. On the are there people in the institutions who want to do the right thing and who can be leaders? Yes, in ways that are so exciting to me. It's not all of them, and they're not always amazing, but they do exist. And one that's such I hope, a harbinger of hope for all of us is University of Alaska system, which is one of the 3 resolution agreements that the OCR has issued in this administration. During the pendency of the investigation for University of Alaska system, the interim chancellor at one of the schools in that system sent out a statement to the entire campus community, inviting the community to view hunting ground, that was the precipitating event for sending the statement. But in the statement, the interim chancellor acknowledged that the university system was under investigation from OCR, that they had reviewed their own records because of the investigation, and that he had identified serious flaws in the ways that the university had responded and not responded to students who had reported abuse, and that he was committed not to doing that anymore, that he wrote in that statement to the entire community, if you harm a student on this community, you will be punished to the full extent of the penalties that we have in our system, and we will start doing that. It was an unbelievable interim statement from that university. And then when OCR entered into a resolution agreement with the university, they created a new website. They put on the web what they had done wrong. They acknowledged it. They were clear about it. They said, we should not have done it. It violated the law, and we are committed to doing better going forward. This is what we're going to do differently. It's unbelievable and so exciting to me. I mean, you hear my enthusiasm in my voice about it because it's rare, right? I mean, most schools would say, well, we're not as bad as this other school, and you think, really? Because let me tell you all the things that we saw. And, I don't really feel like that's a comparison you really want to make. It's not that common for the schools to actually acknowledge, here's something that we did that we should not have done that we want to move forward. But University of Alaska system, boy, is it amazing for what they did, and that is really a reason for hope for me.
why is it rare? Because it seems like even if you didn't care at all, that a successful public relations
Yes,
strategy
yes, right,
would
right.
be what you just identified.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard, in your opinion, from having dealt with so many of these schools and also prosecutors, other governmental departments? Why is it so hard just to say what you just said?
I think
it gives
human nature is
survivors
that
tremendous relief to hear that, even if they're not getting much substantive in addition to the apology.
I 100% agree. I mean, if I were advising schools, I would tell them to do that. I think it's a really good thing to do. But I think that human nature is to want to say, well, I wasn't as bad as you think I was, and so not thank you for pointing out my flaws, but actually I had none. So I think that's where people tend to be. But I do think it's a mistake, and it is exciting to me that University of Alaska is an institution that is worth highlighting for it. I think there are others that are trying. There are others that have tried to get ahead of being investigated, that have tried to say these are the kinds of things that we're doing. Whereas I started by saying, when I came to this work, we were hearing from schools saying, the girls wear such tight jeans, or there's some other reason why this is a new issue for us, we don't know what to do. By the time I was leaving the administration, the schools tended to be saying, right, we realize this is an issue, how do we roll up our sleeves and fix it? And that was rapid movement across the country for what can we do now. Not always, yeah, I'm so excited, this is so great, this is the thing I always wanted to do, but still, we realize this is an issue we have to work on and we want to move it. And that is movement we should hold, we should get more of it, but yes, there are people in these institutions who are doing some of the work, trying to take all of the questions. On your question in the back about whether you should file with OCR, or whether one should file with OCR now, and because of the risk of making bad law. Bad news is that risk exists, period. OCR has hundreds of investigations that it already is in the process of concluding, and in any one of those, they could make bad law. And also, OCR has a capacity to open proactive investigations. And so, if you're worried about not creating a venue for bad resolution, bad precedent, you don't own that. That venue exists, it may happen, so you might as well move forward and choose the venue that feels right to you about how to proceed. I do think it is incredibly important, actually, to report to your school that you think something is wrong if something is wrong, so that is an opportunity to change culture, because the schools can't change if they don't know, period. And it is incredibly important still to talk about what we want, what we think we need. I started this by saying what I needed to hear, and I came to this as an activist. I came to this as a civil rights true believer, and I needed to hear the website needs to be different because people don't get it, right? There's something that somebody else doesn't know that you know, and it's important to ask for it so that you have a chance of getting it. If you don't ask for it, you won't. So yes, it's real that you might create an opportunity for bad precedent. That opportunity exists anyway. You should go for the thing that you want.
I'll just add to that, that I think there's importance in setting the right expectation. And I don't know again, I think it might be too early to figure out, what the pace and whether or not complaints that are coming in about sexual violence are on how they're going to be treated and in what form. But I think it's important to set the expectation, which I think Catherine's absolutely right. Make sure you're reporting and raising these issues with the institution. I think trying to go and rely only on the OCR route might have some pitfalls to that right now. So just setting those expectations, I think, as we talked about. On the question of where are the points of agency and intervention and leadership within educational institutions, certainly going back to my last point, which is to the extent that we make this a legal issue, right, and an issue around lawyers and the ways in which we're going to actually treat this legally, I think some of that leadership ends up falling into the hands of general counsels and lawyers, which are not where I think it needs to be. And so I think really trying to figure out the most successful processes that we've all been engaged with included those with the highest levels of university leadership in some form, right? And so I think you have to have the commitment and the buy-in of those at those levels, and trying to figure out the different pressure points to get there is incredibly important. I think part of the problem that we've created collectively in some ways is that people are very worried about their legal liability, and they're worried about what their alumni are going to think, and that's why she got so much grief about the list, is because being on the list was a shaming moment. But let's figure out, one, how we we allow for there to be multiple ways in which we're shaming people to do the right thing and getting leadership involved. That's one thing. But the second is we want to be out of the situation in which the concerns are about money and alumni and not about students and their safety. And that is something that we have to kind of figure out how to do collectively.
Great. Let's take a couple more questions.
Oh, wow.
Hey, so my alma mater is Reed College, which in 2015 had the highest reported rate of sexual assault per capita among students. Also on that list were other very, very socially liberal schools like Wesleyan and Swarthmore. I'm looking at the link between schools that are extremely socially liberal and the seeming disconnect between that liberalism, which in spheres like this really manifests itself as a commitment to lower those numbers in terms of sexual assault, and on student bodies that are perceived as liberal, where this sort of behavior seems to go up. And I'm wondering if you have addressed that at all in terms of policy or advocacy.
Hey guys, thank you for the panel. A few of you, we spoke before, and I followed your work, followed Secretary King's work, and it's been, you guys have worked wonders. You have, as a self-admitted feminist. Yeah, but I'm in from Washington, and I work pretty close with the current administration. And there are concerns, some concerns that I do have about the progress that you guys have made. The biggest thing is that, like the woman from Tulane mentioned, is that what's been going on, it hasn't reduced the number of incidents. And that's a very big concern. The current administration seems to be focused on undermining your progress. And I'm not a big fan of that. I'm a very big fan of feminine rights. But they're taking a big hold on this wrongfully accused due process narrative. And my question is, and my concern is that, is it going to undermine the progress that you guys have made? And if there is a medium that can be made, what's the most effective route to prevent that undermining?
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks.
Do one more. You already got a microphone?
Hi.
Came with your own?
You know, I bring my own mic. I just want to acknowledge how hard it is to follow that question, the initial question, and the risks that you currently perceive in the way that these questions are being thought about. I just wanted to ask, from your perspectives, so someone working on the outside, I know part of what the federal government did besides prosecution and the actual work of investigation was convening. And as we talk about how to aggregate the right leadership for the right conversations, my question to the two of you would be, where do you see as the appropriate power centers for the proactive convening? And at what level are we talking about? And who, you know, thinking about the balance of institutional power that we're trying to mobilize for such a big project, what are the institutional powers there? We've got the universities, what's in civil society, what's left in government that we rally to be those centers of gravity, to bring the right people together, to mobilize what power we need to get this done.
Great.
Okay, so I will try to take you to them in turn. On your question about why are so many socially liberal institutions places where we see high rates and continued behaviors that we want to see changed. Oddly, it is good news when you see high reporting rates on campus, because it means that there is honesty about what's happening there, and there's a belief that the system can be used for change. What worries me a lot is when we see very low rates reported on a campus, because that's not plausible given the world that we live in right now. And so that says to me that that's a campus that people don't believe in, and that's a campus that people don't feel like they can access the resources on that campus. So that I do not view it as good news when we see lots of rapes reported. I'm not celebrating that, but I do think that means that campus is likely further ahead in the curve in terms of how it communicates to its students what is and is not acceptable, and what it is doing to work on change. I want to be very clear. I am a believer in my core that one is too many. I mean, I think that nobody should be suffering sexual violence anywhere. But I also live in the world. I know that people do. And so I want people to be able to have communities that are supportive, that they can go forward, they can report, and they can start to make that change. And so I think that as much as there is good news to be had in that, there is good news in those reporting rates, because it is at least more honest. And that's what we should be. So for me as an enforcer, what I was doing when I was at the Office for Civil Rights was much more attentive to the places that had low numbers than to the places that had high numbers, because I was much more worried about what was happening because there was too much secrecy in those places. So hold on to that at least. And there's obviously still work to be done in the places even where there's high reporting. On the question about this administration and the focus on men's rights and the focus on fair process, the reality is that the law is that there has to be fair process for everybody involved, and that is the core principle from which all of the enforcement work follows. It is and has been enormously frustrating to me that there is a rhetoric out there in the world that the Obama administration wasn't concerned about fair process for all students involved. It's patently untrue. It's belied by the actual resolution agreements that we entered into. It's belied by the actual investigative work. And the reason that I care so much that there be fair process for everybody is that nobody can believe in effective responsiveness from a school if they're not fair to everybody. If you have a kangaroo court, nobody benefits, period. So we were aggressive about that in the Obama administration. I think they should continue to be aggressive about that. There shouldn't be a shift to worrying only about the boys. We should be worried about everybody. Nobody should be unsafe in our campuses. That actually is the Title IX promise. And so I think our full communities need to be clear about that. I have certainly tried to be clear about that. It was frustrating to try to get that message out because it wasn't what people wanted to hear. But it is an absolute incorrect caricature of the work to suggest that the Obama administration, Anurima's office, were not interested in making sure that there was fairness for all people. To your point about, do we need to be worried about what this administration will do and whether it will turn in one direction? Yes, we have to be worried about that on all fronts, right? And that is part of why I say continue to advocate, continue to let them know that we're watching, continue to make sure that there will be absolute fealty to what the law demands. But there's not a new law about that. That has already been the demand because that's what will make people safe. And then, Eliza, to your question about how do we follow and where are the centers of gravity, this will not be surprising to folks who know me, but I think that we have to take all the places, right? You know, it would be really nice if the federal government continued to use its levers as aggressively as the last administration did. I don't have a lot of optimism that will happen, but that would be nice if they did. Regardless of whether they do, we need to be doing meetings like this. I started by saying how grateful I am to all of you for coming together because it is an uplift for me. It is an uplift, I hope, for all of us. It is what will help us to be able to put one foot in front of the other to keep doing this work moving forward because we need to do that. But we need to be doing that on our campuses, loud, aggressive about what it is that you're doing at Tulane that can be better and more, that we're doing at every campus because that matters. We need to be doing it off campus. We need to be making sure that we're there in the P12 spaces as well so that nobody is leaving behind the little kids who also are subject to these kinds of harms. We need to be thinking about it in research space so that there's data that continues to be effective and usable. We need to be looking at actually what tools work. One of the things that was most heartrending for me in the beginning task force work was that we learned that there is no research-supported prevention mechanism that works for kids who are in high school and college, period. We just don't have that now in the country. So we should be building that. That would be really nice to know what works to make sure that students are safe. And so for me, we should be taking every center, working it and pushing it forward because that's what's going to make us safe. And we do have the capacity to do that because that's hyper-local as well as it is national, and we ought to be doing all.
So I entirely agree with Catherine on all answers that she just gave.
Always the best answer. I find, just agree with everything she says.
Catherine.
I
actually, this doesn't always happen, so
yeah, that's true.
most days.
It should happen more.
They should have more. So I'll just add a couple things. On the question of centers of gravity, I think part of I do agree that part of the usefulness of having the federal government's convening power was that we had a lot of different voices in the room, not only to talk to one another, but also to sort of harness power of those voices in particular places and to get that out to the world. And so I feel like you're giving me an assist to just say what I was going to say anyway and attribute it to you, which is, I mean, I think in some ways the way we're engaging on social media, which is what we were talking about yesterday, is we have to think about issues across the board and not just organizations. And so trying to figure out ways in which everyone in this room who are taking these issues on from different perspectives can really figure out how to harness the energy around sexual assault as opposed to around your particular organization. How do we actually organize in that kind of way? And I think without some kind of central place to do that, it becomes harder to do, and we become fractured in ways that may not be as helpful to the larger cause of getting people engaged on social media, but also learning about what's happening with sexual assault. But beyond that, let me just end by saying something that hasn't been part of this conversation, which I think is important and is raised by some of the concerns around due process and fairness. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, and we talked about in the last 24 hours, is race and how it plays into our work on sexual violence and intersectionality. And I think it's incredibly important for us to understand, sort of how all of these pieces intersect. And so what I said yesterday, which is I don't remember a complaint, and I didn't have a chance to ask Catherine this yet, but I don't remember a complaint that I got from a person of color who was sexually assaulted by a white assailant. I don't remember a complaint that we investigated along those lines. And,
Oh, I did.
Yeah, so Catherine did. I just think there's some ways in which we have to think about how that plays out in terms of whether people feel comfortable reporting, what are the kind of processes we're engaged in, how do we think about some of the due process, who it is that's actually being brought up and investigated, and how do we actually understand those dynamics? And they're dynamics that play out in how we think about the different mechanisms to address what's happening in terms of sexual violence on campuses and otherwise. And so part of the conversations we're having about restorative justice and other pieces of how we might deal with what's happening in terms of sexual violence are part and parcel of that larger conversation. So I do want to make sure we have at least that moment to acknowledge how important it is to think about how this all plays out.
That's great, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I think that, given the shortness of time that we have left, maybe you'd just like to talk about that a little bit more, because we have been having some interesting conversations here about, restorative justice has become a little bit of a buzzword, and I think that often different people are using that term without a lot of specificity around it, and they might not even be talking about the same thing when they are talking about it because it's so poorly defined, at least at this stage. And to some extent, the question that
The mic to one more person, because I promised to do that, so
Okay,
we'll let her ask her question.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Graff, and I'm from Stop Sexual Assault in Schools. I also am responsible for all of the SART training in Washington State, and I think your comment resonated that medical advocacy, in our state, most campus assaults meet us first. So they come into the emergency departments, they contact an advocacy agency. So I think that's just a critical component where Title IX, those people know nothing about Title IX, at least in Washington State. So my question is, how do we get campuses, whether it's K through 12, college, how do we get them to be accountable for a 360 approach for people who come forward and say, I was assaulted? How do we get the campuses to be accountable that they get advocacy and that they get medical services? We're doing our part in the state by training all of these people with Title IX, but I think the schools own an accountability piece
Unfortunately, in our state, we have several universities on the naughty list. And so we've been out doing a lot of education with them, and they've told us they need that. They need to know what the community resources are.
One, I want to say thank you, and you deserve applause for what you've been doing in Washington State, so it's really exciting for me to meet you. And you're right that we need to see more places doing it. And I think that we are starting to see some more change, partly because of the change you've led in your state and its efficacy. There are the kinds of 360 approach is a regular component of resolution agreements with OCR. That takes a while to get to, and that counts in the dozens as distinct from in the thousands, which is where it needs to count. That we are starting to see more places take note of the kind of work that you're doing, take note of the reality that it would likely be part of a resolution agreement with OCR, and so they might as well get to it on their own anyway. So there's progress being made, but I do think that's got to be more of the conversation. And a piece of that that's recurringly frustrating to me is hearing the binary either or. Should she report to the police or should she report to the school, as distinct from she or he should choose the venue and figure out what's safe, and we need to make sure, as Anurima started with from the Missoula example, that reporting to the police is a productive activity itself, and that the full panoply of ways that supports should take place on campuses do take place. And so how do we do it? We keep asking for it, and we also keep showing how to lead the way, and you frankly have done most of the work on leading the way, so thank you for that also. And I see it having legs and having meaning, so I'm really grateful for that piece. On the piece that I think the two of you started on, where we are on intersectionality and what does that mean for us, we're not in a great place, I think, on that. I think that we don't see enough conversation about what it means to come forward and report at a historically black college university, what it means to come forward and report in a necessarily coded interracial interaction, what it means to be either party of a different race in that interaction, what it means to be in a same-sex interaction and complaining to the school, to the wider community about what has happened to you, what expectations are about if the attacker is a woman as versus a man. It's sort of where we are when we are outside of a heteronormative set of assumptions that is also a single race set of assumptions or race biased set of assumptions. And I think that as much movement as we have made forward, there's obviously tremendous room for growth in all of those areas also. And to the extent that we are part of a national movement for change and for progress, we need to be making sure that we are conversant with all of those and thoughtful about where all the traps lie in what race assumptions will be, what same-sex assumptions will be, what assumptions are about gender performance in complaining, in reporting, in taking action, in perpetrating abuse, et cetera. Because what we want is a safe community, period. What we want is for people to be able to be themselves at school and learning, and not expecting that rape and sexual violence will be a part of their growing up experience, period. And so to be able to own what's happening and what is the change that we want requires a fulsome conversation on all of those points.
And I mean, just add to that, the ways in which this plays out for students and persons with disabilities, the way it plays out for undocumented students on campus, and even the conversation about who you can go to for support, where you can go to, and how you even think about your own personal space and the ability to understand and comprehend the assaults that are occurring. That is, those are all the kinds of things that we have to think about. And we talked yesterday a little bit about, the other kinds of federal laws and state laws that can play in, and how we have to sort of think about not only think about the intersectionality in terms of how it plays out in terms of how the assault itself, but how we actually address it on campuses. To your point about restorative justice, restorative justice means so many different things. I entirely agree with you. I think part of the question is back to, and this is something that I said to Lynn yesterday, I really learned from Lynn in part, which is how important it is for someone who's going through a process after experiencing in assault and trauma to be able to have a range of options that they can consider in terms of how they move forward. And so the ability to talk to a counselor, to get interim supports is important in terms of whether or not someone feels comfortable reporting to the police and otherwise. So the ability to think that there might be a process where you may be able to, how do we think about a process that's trying to address trauma and make someone whole? There may be lots of different ways in which that happens, and it may not be an adjudicative process to do that, right? And so my point only is to say, I think we have to think about how, what are the purposes of these processes, what are the goals, and what are we trying to actually make sure Title IX, which is really about making sure that students have the equal, have educational opportunities and are able to engage in a safe and supportive climate. What are the different ways we can allow them to do that and give them some supports along those lines? And the legal adjudicative process is one of those tools and one of those processes. In that there may be others, but I think you have to think very carefully about what those processes are and how we set them up, and they may be very different based on what campuses you're on and what kind of situations we're talking about. So I don't think there's not some panacea. If there was, I think we would have figured it out, right? But like, there's not, hey, just adopt restorative justice and that's going to restore everybody.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a conversation that we should continue to have, and that many campuses have already been having in a variety of forums about what are the openings for some of that work to be done in conjunction with a lot of what has already been put in place to comply with timeline.
I agree with everything you're saying. The only thing I was wondering was just just to try to get a common vernacular going in this area, because it feels sometimes like some of these conversations are going past each other because people may not mean the same thing when they use a term that's as poorly defined. And that's not necessarily limited to restorative justice. There are a lot of other areas in this space where people say informal resolution and they may mean different things.
Interim measures, consent, these are all these things we could spend all of our time trying to figure out what they,
But restorative justice is a current common thing, and it came up yesterday, which is why I brought it up. I cannot thank you enough. I feel like I learned more just sitting here in the last 90 minutes than I have in the last 10 years of doing this. So it's really been wonderful for me to have the opportunity to talk with both of you. And I appreciate so much you being here to share all of the things you've learned in this journey with us. I think everyone here came to this conference with a sense of anxiety, that in fact, we had our program brochure, slide up, and someone said, can you please take it down? I just cannot look at a 10-foot Donald Trump's head right now anymore, And so I think there's tremendous anxiety about what we are facing. And it helps us to have our heroes and our champions here with us. So thank you.
Thanks. Helps
Let's
us too.
thank you.